This is Asia Now.
Hello and good morning. It is 11 a.m. in Singapore and Hong Kong, 8:30 in New Delhi, 10 o'clock in Jakarta. I'm Yasmin Yonkers. At this hour, Pope Francis is on the final stop of his Asia-Pacific tour, meeting Singapore's leaders and community members. He's expected to speak soon, along with President Tharman and will preside over Mass at the National Stadium. Northern Vietnam still coping with Typhoon Yagi's wrath. Authorities struggling to tame flooding and rescue those trapped in landslides. At least 179 people are dead and more than 140 others missing. North Korea fired multiple short-range ballistic missiles this morning, just days after leader Kim Jong-un vowed to redouble efforts to make his nuclear force fully ready for combat. South Korea has strongly condemned the tests. We begin with our special coverage of Pope Francis's visit to Singapore. The head of the Catholic Church has met with the country's president and prime minister, and he's just minutes away from delivering a state address. Later today, an event that thousands of people have been preparing for months. Pope Francis will preside over a mass at the National Stadium. 50,000 people are expected to attend, and this is the first visit to the country for the 87-year-old pontiff and only the second papal visit since Pope John Paul II's 5-hour stop, and that was back in 1986. The Pope was welcomed at Parliament House with an honour guard, and it was part of a visit that included meetings with President Tharman and Prime Minister Lawrence Wong. The pontiff signed the guest book, and he was presented with an orchid hybrid, that's Singapore's national flower that's been named after him. Top Singapore cabinet ministers were among those attending this event at Parliament House. And after Pope Francis delivers his state address at the National University of Singapore a little later, he will be meeting other government officials, civil society groups, and members of the diplomatic corps. And he will cap the day, as we mentioned, with a mass at the National Stadium. It's worth noting Pope Francis will be traveling around Singapore in an electric vehicle. Tomorrow, Pope Francis will visit St. Teresa's home. That's an elderly residence home. And he has done, as he has done in the other three countries that he just visited on this Asia-Pacific tour, the Pope will end his trip with an inter-religious youth meeting. And that will be held at the Catholic Junior College. CNA's Geraldine Yap has more on what we can expect from the Pope's state address that's coming up.
There are about 800 people who have registered to attend this state address today. They include members of the government as well as civil society, and in particular representatives of inter-religious organizations, and as well as students. I see students from several junior colleges that they have already taken their seats. One of the key topics that we can expect Pope to cover in his state address will be the topic of unity, peace, and religious unity and harmony. Now, this is also a topic that he had spoken about during his earlier visit to the Indonesian capital of Jakarta, where he spoke at a mosque. Now, we can also expect the Pope to speak about environmental sustainability and climate change. Now, this is also a topic that he spoke about during his Asia-Pacific tour, which also covered the countries of Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea. Now, another topic that the Pope might talk about is the topic of young people, children and youths in particular. We know that the Pope is known to regularly meet up with children and youth, and in fact he will be engaging with some Singaporean youths tomorrow at an inter-religious dialogue at the Catholic Junior College.
Well, Pope Francis started his Asia-Pacific tour in Indonesia. He arrived in Jakarta in the afternoon of the 3rd of September, and he was greeted by Indonesian officials on the tarmac. He was the third Pope to visit the Southeast Asian country and the first one in 35 years. As a Muslim-majority country, Indonesia's 270 million strong population is 87% Muslim, but it also has the third largest Christian population in Asia. And while the Pope had limited activity planned on the day of his arrival, crowds did line the streets while the pontiff made his way to the Vatican embassy. It was there that he also met with a group of refugees, migrants, and the sick. His official activities began the following day with a grand ceremony at the Istana Merdeka, led by President Joko Widodo and President-elect Prabowo Subianto. Members of the diplomatic community were also there. And he took note of the Indonesian laws and mottos, which he says promotes social justice, unity in diversity, and also peace. The Pope stressed the need for interfaith talks as an indispensable tool for fighting intolerance and religious extremism. Pope Francis himself led those interfaith talks when he visited Southeast Asia's largest mosque, that is the Istiqlal Mosque in Jakarta. He met with the Grand Imam. Both signed a declaration to promote peace and to protect the environment. Highlighting the need for religious harmony, the pontiff said the tunnel that connects the mosque to Jakarta's cathedral sends a very deep meaning of unity. The Pope then presided over a mass for tens of thousands at the Gelora Bung Karno Stadium in the Indonesian capital. And addressing the packed stands, the Pope called on the faithful to sow the seeds of love, confidently tread the path of dialogue, and continue to showing goodness and kindness. The first leg of the pontiff's longest and farthest trip was not without serious security issues. Indonesian authorities confirmed 7 people had been detained for making terror threats against the Catholic leader. And the suspects are accused of posting statements and images threatening bomb blasts at the Pope's public meetings in Jakarta as well. Well, Pope Francis and Singapore President Tharman Shanmugaratnam are about to deliver speeches at a state address at the National University of Singapore. It's time for us to listen in.
President of the Republic of Singapore.
Your Holiness, Pope Francis, Your Eminences, former Presidents, Dr. Tony Tan and Madam Halimah Yacob, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. I'm delighted to welcome His Holiness Pope Francis on his first state visit to Singapore. This will be the second papal visit to Singapore, the first being a brief visit by Pope John Paul II 38 years ago. The Holy See, under Your Holiness' leadership, has been a strong and principled advocate for human fraternity and environmental sustainability. Indeed, you have spoken passionately about these issues during your trip in Southeast Asia. These are critical challenges in the world today. The global order is weakening, and conflict and aggression remain unabated. There has been growing intolerance within societies themselves. At the same time, we are seeing accelerating climate change, making the world less safe for humanity. The global community needs to make more determined and forthright efforts to address each of these challenges. Your Holiness has been an impassioned global voice against war. You have consistently called for efforts to promote harmony and dialogue between different groups and faiths. Your Holiness will speak about this important topic to our youth tomorrow. This is an issue that resonates with Singaporeans. We are a multiracial, multi-religious, and multicultural society. There was a time in our history when these realities gave way to intercommunal tensions. For us, solidarity and harmony have therefore been at the core and will remain core features in our national development. Today, Singaporeans treasure being in a country where various ethnic and religious communities live peacefully together. The Constitution enshrines their protection from discrimination, and beyond that, ensures that racial harmony be promoted. Diversity is tolerated in Singapore, but it has come to be more than that. It is embraced and viewed as bringing richness to our lives. It defines our very identity as a nation and gives us pride to be Singaporeans. Our religious communities have each played their part to make this unusual circumstance possible. They respect one another, and the young especially seek out what they have in common. Our religious leaders play a key role in guiding their communities in understanding and practicing their own religious beliefs, while also fostering shared norms and values with others. It is ultimately this spirit of openness, mutual accommodation, and respect that allows different religious communities to thrive in Singapore. None of this came naturally. It has been the work of nation building over decades. We have worked hard to promote racial and religious harmony through our schools, public housing estates, and through national service that our boys go through. It is also the result of Singaporeans themselves being at ease with each other as fellow schoolmates, neighbors, and fellow citizens, sharing common hopes and working for the good of our country. Yet we know that racial and religious harmony is not immutable. Forging a culture of accommodation, let alone trust, takes consistent and continuing effort anywhere in the world. We have to build a deeper understanding of each other, strengthen interactions between different ethnic and religious groups, and actively weaken the ground for forces that seek to pull communities apart. In this regard, we continue to learn from the experiences and practices abroad, both the successes and failures, just as others seek to borrow elements of the Singapore approach. The International Conference on Cohesive Societies that Singapore convenes seeks to contribute thinking and exchange valuable lessons. I thank the Vatican for participating regularly and actively in the conference. The Catholic Church has also been a strong voice for the cause of environmental sustainability. Your Holiness's support for the 2015 Paris Agreement and your call to action for an agreement on climate action, your call for agreement on climate action at COP28 have inspired many. In your Holiness's encyclical, Laudato Si, you articulated a vision which recognizes the interconnectedness of all life and the need to care for our common home. You have also urged people everywhere to recognize that we are caretakers and stewards of our shared home. This message is all the more relevant as the world struggles to meet growing energy demand while achieving a transition to clean energies, and a world that must feed a rapidly growing population while avoiding further environmental degradation. Singapore has made sustainability a national priority since our independence 59 years ago. As a small city-state, we have sought to balance development with environmental responsibility. This applies to the greening of our city, all the way from Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's Garden City vision in 1967 to our current City in Nature. It also applies to water and what we have done to encourage its conservation and ensure sustainable supply, not only through reservoirs, but the recycling of used water and desalination. The Singapore Green Plan 2030 serves as a guide in our concerted efforts to counter climate change. It includes quadrupling solar energy deployment and reducing the waste sent to landfills by 30%. Singapore has also implemented carbon taxes with graduated increases to support our transition to a low-carbon economy. Our approach to sustainability and climate adaptation is underpinned by climate science and R&D. It informs the education of our young at all levels, community initiatives, our long-term investments, and our climate policies for the future. I would like to thank the Catholic Church for the direct and concrete contributions it has made to Singapore over the decades. I'm referring to Catholic institutions dealing with education, healthcare, and social welfare. Indeed, our oldest Catholic schools, St. Joseph's Institution and Convent of the Holy Infant Jesus, have a history going back over 170 years. Many Singaporeans from all races and creeds have benefited from their years in the schools, being imbued with both knowledge and a spirit of compassion and service. And indeed, many of the orphans that the Convent of Holy Infant Jesus took in through its gates and brought up became sterling members of the community. In your message for the World Day of Peace last year, Your Holiness said that the pandemic left in its wake, I quote, the realization that we all need one another, unquote. I share this view, and I'm glad that Singapore and the Holy See are committed to fostering cohesive societies, peace, and an understanding of our common humanity. As we continue this journey of seeking solutions to common challenges, I'm confident that the ties between Singapore and the Holy See, as friends and partners, will continue to deepen in the years ahead.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, His Holiness Pope Francis.
Pope Francis will be speaking in Italian, and we bring you English subtitles.
Signor Presidente, distinte autorità, illustri rappresentanti della società civile, membri del corpo diplomatico. Ringrazio il Signor Presidente per le cortesi parole di benvenuto che mi ha gentilmente rivolto e che rinnovano in me la riconoscenza per la sua recente visita in Vaticano. A tutte le autorità sono grato per la cordiale accoglienza in questa vostra città-stato, crocevia commerciale di primaria importanza e luogo di incontro tra diversi popoli. Chi arriva qui per la prima volta non può non essere impressionato dalla selva di modernissimi grattacieli che sembrano sorgere dal mare. Essi sono una chiara testimonianza dell'ingegno umano, della dinamicità della società di Singapore e dell'acume dello spirito imprenditoriale che qui hanno trovato un terreno fertile per esprimersi. Quella di Singapore è una storia di crescita e resilienza. Da umili origini questa nazione ha raggiunto un alto livello di sviluppo, dimostrando che esso è frutto di decisioni razionali e non del caso. È il risultato di un costante impegno nel portare a termine progetti e iniziative ben ponderate e in sintonia con le caratteristiche specifiche del luogo. Proprio in questi giorni ricorre il 101° anniversario della nascita di Lee Kuan Yew, primo ministro della Repubblica di Singapore, che dal 1959 al 1990 mantenne tale incarico e diede un forte impulso alla rapida crescita e trasformazione del Paese. È importante inoltre che Singapore non solo abbia prosperato economicamente, ma che si sia sforzata di costruire una società nella quale la giustizia sociale e il bene comune sono tenute in grande considerazione. Penso in particolare alla vostra dedizione nel migliorare le condizioni di vita dei cittadini attraverso politiche abitative pubbliche, un'istruzione di alta qualità e un sistema sanitario efficiente. Auspico che questi sforzi continuino fino a coinvolgere pienamente tutti gli abitanti di Singapore. E a questo proposito vorrei segnalare il rischio che un certo pragmatismo e una certa esaltazione del merito comportano, vale a dire la conseguenza non intenzionale di legittimare l'esclusione di coloro che si trovano ai margini dei benefici del progresso. Su questo fronte riconosco e lodo le varie politiche e iniziative messe in atto per sostenere i più deboli e auspico che venga presentata particolare attenzione ai poveri, agli anziani, le cui fatiche hanno gettato le fondamenta per la Singapore che conosciamo oggi, e anche per tutelare la dignità dei lavoratori migranti, che molto contribuiscono alla costruzione della società e ai quali occorre garantire un salario equo. Le sofisticate tecnologie dell'era digitale e i rapidi sviluppi nell'uso dell'intelligenza artificiale non possono farci dimenticare che è essenziale coltivare relazioni umane reali, relazioni umane concrete, e che queste tecnologie si possono valorizzare proprio per avvicinarsi gli uni agli altri, promuovendo comprensione e solidarietà, e non per isolarsi pericolosamente in una realtà fittizia o impalpabile. Singapore è un mosaico di etnie, un mosaico di culture e religioni che convivono in armonia, e questa parola è molto importante, l'armonia. Il raggiungimento e la conservazione di questa positiva inclusività sono favorite dalla imparzialità dei poteri pubblici, impegnati in dialogo costruttivo con tutti, rendendo possibile che ognuno apporti il suo peculiare contributo al bene comune e non consentendo all'estremismo o all'intolleranza di acquisire forza e di mettere in pericolo la pace sociale. Il rispetto reciproco, la collaborazione, il dialogo e la libertà di professare il proprio credo nella lealtà alla legge comune sono condizioni determinanti del successo e della stabilità ottenuti da Singapore, requisiti per uno sviluppo non conflittuale e caotico, ma uno sviluppo equilibrato e sostenibile. La Chiesa Cattolica a Singapore, fin dall'inizio della sua presenza, ha cercato di offrire il proprio apporto peculiare al cammino di questa nazione, soprattutto nei settori dell'istruzione e della sanità, avvalendosi dello spirito di sacrificio e dedizione dei missioneri e dei fedeli. Sempre animata dal Vangelo di Gesù Cristo, la comunità cattolica è anche in prima linea nelle opere di carità, contribuendo in modo significativo agli sforzi umanitari e gestendo a questo fine diverse istituzioni sanitarie e molte organizzazioni umanitarie, tra cui la Caritas, che tutti conosciamo. La Chiesa, inoltre, secondo l'indicazione della Dichiarazione Nostra Aetate del Concilio Vaticano II sulle relazioni con le religioni non cristiane, ha costantemente promosso il dialogo interreligioso e la collaborazione tra diverse comunità di fede con spirito di apertura e rispetto reciproco, fondamentali per la costruzione di una società che sia giusta e pacifica. Questa mia visita giunge a 43 anni da quando furono stabilite le relazioni diplomatiche tra la Santa Sede e Singapore. Essa si propone di confermare nella fede i cattolici ed esortarli a proseguire con gioia e dedizione la collaborazione con tutti gli uomini e le donne di buona volontà per la costruzione di una società civile sana e coesa per il bene comune e per una testimonianza cristallina della propria fede. Singapore ha anche un ruolo specifico da giocare nell'ordine internazionale. Questo non lo dimentichiamo. Quest'ordine internazionale è minacciato oggi da conflitti e guerre sanguinose e mi rallegro che abbia meritoriamente promosso il multilateralismo e un ordine basato su regole da tutti condivise. Vi incoraggio a continuare a lavorare per l'unità e la fraternità del genere umano, a beneficio del bene comune di tutti i popoli e di tutte le nazioni, con una comprensione non escludente né ristretta degli interessi nazionali. E mi sia consentito ricordare anche il ruolo della famiglia. Primo luogo in cui ognuno impara a relazionarsi con gli altri, a essere amato e a amare. Nelle condizioni sociali attuali, le fondamenta su cui si basano le famiglie sono messe in discussione e rischiano di venire indebolite. Occorre che esse vengano poste nella condizione di trasmettere i valori che danno senso e forma alla vita e di insegnare ai giovani a formare relazioni solide, relazioni sane fra loro. Sono perciò da lodare gli sforzi compiuti per promuovere, proteggere e sostenere l'unità familiare attraverso il lavoro di varie istituzioni. Non possiamo nascondere che oggi viviamo in una crisi ambientale e non dobbiamo sottovalutare l'impatto che una piccola nazione come Singapore può avere in essa. La vostra posizione unica vi offre accesso a capitali, tecnologie e talenti, risorse che possono guidare l'innovazione per prendersi cura della salute della nostra casa comune. il vostro impegno per uno sviluppo sostenibile e per la salvaguardia del creato è un esempio da seguire e la ricerca di soluzioni innovative per affrontare le sfide ambientali può incoraggiare anche altri paesi a fare lo stesso. Singapore è un brillante esempio di ciò che l'umanità può realizzare lavorando insieme in armonia, con senso di responsabilità e con spirito di inclusività e fraternità. Questo è come un riassunto del vostro atteggiamento, no? Lavorare insieme in armonia, con senso di responsabilità e con spirito di fraternità e inclusività. Vi incoraggio a continuare su questa strada, confidando nella promessa di Dio e nel suo amore paterno per tutti. Signor Presidente, signore e signori, Dio vi aiuti a rispondere ai bisogni e alle attese della vostra gente e vi incoraggia ad sperimentare che con chi rimane umile e grato Lui può compiere grandi cose per il bene di tutti. Dio benedica Singapore.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the State Address. The President...
Applause for Pope Francis, who's just delivered a state address, along with President Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who's right by him on stage at the University Cultural Centre in Singapore. The two distinguished gentlemen have been covering a wide range of topics. Let's start with President Tharman, who gave praise for the Pope's push for human fraternity and environmental sustainability. He mentioned the Pope's support for the 2015 Paris Agreement and climate action at last year's COP28. It's interesting to note that the Pope has been shuttled around in Singapore in a Hyundai EV. It's in line with what the Vatican is pushing for, as it's replacing its existing vehicles with electric ones to make their entire fleet CO2 neutral by the year 2030. President Tharman talked about Singapore's green initiatives as well, that Singapore has a green plan for 2030 in place, involving not just climate scientists and the community, but also the young. And the president, who's walking off the stage along with Pope Francis, also thanked the Catholic Church for contributions in Singapore and also the prominent Catholic schools here, like St. Joseph's Institution and Convent of the Holy Infant Jesus, for producing great members of Singapore's society. Well, the Pope touched on migrant workers and the need to protect them and their dignity. He also called on Singapore to lean on its digital strength to help the climate situation and also to help elevate the poor. And he called on Singapore to lean on its multilateral arrangements to help solve war and conflict in the world. Well, the Pope talked about love for family and the elderly as well, and he warned of the pitfalls of artificial intelligence. Also standing by at the University Cultural Centre is our correspondent, Leong Wai Kit, and he's been listening, of course, to the speech. Wai Kit, you know, we've heard the Pope and the President speak. I must ask you what stood out for you. And because you've been with the Pope the entire length of his Asia-Pacific tour, how does the Pontiff's final message align with the rest of what he's been talking about this visit?
Well, that's right. Now, we've heard both President Tharman and Pope Francis speak earlier, and you've done a great job summarizing the key points of what they spoke about. There were overlapping themes, of course. They both talked about global conflicts. They both talked about social harmony. They both also talked about the environment. Pope Francis is literally driving home this message while he's in Singapore because he's traveling in an electric vehicle while he's here. Now, it's clear that wherever Pope Francis goes, he uses the characteristics or the qualities of that country to home in his message so that it's more relevant and relatable. And some of these messages include not leaving anyone behind. He used Singapore's example of economic prosperity, that despite that, Singapore has still policies to ensure that no one is left behind, and that resonates with Pope Francis's teachings and his values of reaching out to the vulnerable and to the poor. He also said that despite Singapore's prosperity, there's social justice, and that's also one theme that he has made very clear during his papal visit throughout Asia Pacific. He also talked about how he was impressed with Singapore's skyscrapers and developments, and talked about, as you said earlier, Yasmin, technology, AI. Now that is one pet topic of Pope Francis as well, because he's made it very clear that AI, technology, cannot erode humanity. He's made this clear several times, that technology and AI can be welcomed if it can help humanity. Now he also talked about the role of the family, and that was when you were talking before coming to me, Yasmin. What he said was the construction, the foundation of families, which is construction. Let me just say that again. It's quite a mouthful. If I remember correctly, he said the foundation in which families are built on are now being challenged by, and I quote, current social conditions, and that this runs the risk of being weakened further. Now, Pope Francis did not elaborate further, but his remarks come just as recent regional developments are pushing for, or if not have pushed for, same-sex marriage between men and men, women and women. In Singapore, in fact, we have abolished Section 377A, and that means that it is no longer illegal for men to have sex. However, Singapore has also sought to protect the definition of family to be between man and woman. And of course, Pope Francis had to talk about Singapore's, and as you've mentioned this yesterday quite eloquently, Yasmin, the social fabric. He had a first glimpse of Singapore's social fabric when 4 children representing different ethnic groups performed for him at the welcoming ceremony. And he said that this is something that is not to be taken granted for, and yet sort of highlighted Singapore's efforts in maintaining and promoting this social harmony.
Yeah, I saw them do their dance for him as he got off the airplane yesterday, and they also greeted him, of course, in national languages of Singapore. Wykit, what can you tell us about the papal mass that's being held at the National Stadium later this evening?
Well, throughout Pope Francis's Asia-Pacific tour, the papal mass is often the highlight for the faithfuls in that particular country. Needless to say, many Catholics in Singapore have been balloting for a seat at the papal mass. Some 50,000 are set to attend. In fact, when the Pope first came to Singapore, Pope John Paul II in 1986, he had also conducted papal mass in that vicinity, in Kallang Stadium, in that area. Right now, Pope Francis is also conducting papal mass in that area, in Sports Hub. You can expect security to be tightened. I spoke about the level of security that the police are treating with Pope Francis's visit, and that is the same level as that of the Shangri-La Dialogue. In fact, security is so tight that when we journalists left Parliament House earlier in a mini van, the van had to be literally sealed, meaning they literally took a sticker and stuck the doors. Something like a concept of a sealed envelope, to make sure that the envelope is not opened or tampered with, and that gives security officers a visual cue that it is secure. So you can imagine the security situation later at Sports Hub. There will be individual checks, there'll be security checks on vehicles as well, perhaps road closures, all hands on deck, all boots on the ground.
For sure, road closures. We've been talking about this on our domestic radio stations here in Singapore. You know, Wykit, you've been part of the papal entourage, the media team that's come all the way from the Vatican through to the 4 countries, and then you're going back to Rome with the Pope. We know that there's to be a debrief on this airplane. Do you know anything about what's to come and what he might likely talk about?
Well, we don't know yet, but we do know for sure that when we travel back with the Pope from Singapore back to Rome, there will be a media conference. We don't know how long he'll speak for, because we don't know whether or not he's up for speaking long, or whether or not he'll give us long or short answers when there's a Q&A session. But we are told that there will be a media conference, likely because, he's spent 11 days across Asia Pacific, he will surely have some concluding thoughts that he wants to put across. And that's the only time between Singapore to Rome. It's about a 13 and a half hour flight. 12 and a half hour flight rather. So we will have that amount of time to work out details of the media conference. What I'm told for most papal flights that are returning back to Vatican is that the media conference will be held. Everyone gets a chance to ask a question, and then Pope Francis, Pope Francis would make concluding remarks.
I trust you're crafting your question already. Wai Kit, thank you so very much for the coverage. Leong Wai Kit reporting live for us from NUS University Cultural Centre in Singapore. Well, earlier today, the Pope visited Parliament House. And he was welcomed at Parliament House with an honour guard. It was part of a visit that included meetings with President Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Prime Minister Lawrence Wong. The pontiff signed the guest book, and he was presented with an orchid hybrid, that's Singapore's national flower, that's been named after him. Top Singapore cabinet ministers were also among those attending this event at Parliament House. Pope Francis did also meet other government officials in the building, and he will be meeting more as the day progresses, also civil society groups and members of the diplomatic corps. And he'll cap today with a mass at the National Stadium. Wai Kit, of course, having given us a preview of that particular event. Well, in the guest book that the Pope signed, he wrote, "Just as the star guided the three wise men, may the light of wisdom always guide Singapore in building a united society capable of transmitting hope." And for sure, there will be more coverage on Pope Francis's visit to Singapore later on CNA across our various platforms, television, radio, and digital. At our website, I have to mention this, it's cna.asia. Please join us.